So welcome to our presentation, Building a Living World from Ancient Ruins. My name is Benjamin Hall, World Director on Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and I'm joined today by my good friend and colleague.
Thierry Dansereau, so I was the art director in Assassin's Creed Odyssey. So Ben and I have been working around 3 years together on that project, and we are very, very happy to be with you guys today for today's talk. And we do hope that you'll enjoy it.
So, in terms of takeaways, one of the big things that we'd like to share today is the philosophy of how we went about building the world of ancient Greece for Assassin's Creed, and some of the things that we learned along the way, and some of the things that we are really proud of what we accomplished along that route. So one of the big things for us was by remaining true to our vision and disciplined in how we worked, trusting in each other and with our team as well, we were able to build a world that was everything we wanted it to be, while keeping the team engaged and empowered, and building a world that was laid the foundations for a game that was critically acclaimed.
Yes, and you'll see throughout this presentation, there's key aspects that for us were very important in the production of this world. Those are the 6 main key points that will go back at the very end of this presentation, and it will be detailed throughout also the presentation. So of course, there's going to be a lot of content shared with you guys today. So to make it clear and very understandable as possible, we separated this presentation in parts. So we'll go through the project overview. We'll speak on how we did establish the vision for this game. We'll talk about the world phases that we've put in place for the production of this game. And then we'll conclude, and you'll be able to ask us questions at the very end. So you'll be able to know where we're at any given moment just by looking at the upper bar on the presentation. So as always, in Assassin's Creed, we wanted to create and pick a setting that is a pivotal moment in the story, a period that deeply impacts the story of mankind, which will allow for plenty of gameplay opportunities. So we also wanted a setting and a period that are connected to the story we want to tell. That idea of a place torn between the order and free will, a time, the old world and the new world, a setting where mankind is at the eve of its more astonishing progress and discovery, but at the same time risking of losing it all to war and violence.
And that war was the Peloponnesian War. The onset of the Peloponnesian War allowed us to focus on the picture postcard of Greece, while at the same time implementing the little bubbles and pockets of the contrast of war and of the onset of war in ancient Greece. So really, ancient Greece in its golden age was the perfect setting for what we wanted to do.
True.
But to do that, we needed a vision. So the vision was laid out at the very beginning of the project by the creative director, Jonathan Demont. And the vision that was going to be part of the pillars of every single part of the game, the world, the narrative, the art, was to, during the golden age of ancient Greece, determine your path on the epic Odyssey of a legendary Greek hero. So this was something that was defined very, very early on, as with a lot of video games, and was something that was going to filter down into everything we did for the next 3 years.
So the first thing we really started to do is to try to gather as much reference as possible. So the first thing we did is to get to see what type of movie were produced with the ancient Greece or the Greek mythology as a main topic. So we've been watching a lot of movie and screenshot them to make sure that we've nailed what they had in common. We did the same exercise with all the games that were produced with the Greek mythology or the Greek as the main setting. So the key thread were to see what were the key threads in those games and movies, to see if we could either tap into them or reinvent them in some cases. And we did the same exercise with contemporary painters. So we wanted to see how they painted or visualized those that time period. So artists like John William Goodward or John William Waterhouse were very inspirational for us.
And of course, being an Assassin's Creed game, everything's based on history. So we wanted to make sure we tapped into the rich ancient history of Greece, which was something that was incredibly diverse and something that we realized we didn't know very much about, so we needed help. So our goal was to build a living world, an authentic, credible world based on this ancient setting. But today, most of that world is only a few centimeters above the ground. Quite a lot of that world is still actually many feet below the ground. So we needed to find somebody who could help us understand what this world was so that we could best create it and we could make credible choices creatively. So our help arrived when we met Stephanie Aruata, who's a doctor in Greek history. And we met her during the reference trip to Greece, which Thierry will talk about a little bit later on. And it became apparent very quickly that the things that she knew about Greece were things that we needed to know, things that we could tap into, things that we could utilize, and things that were going to help us make a better game. Stephanie also had a really cool Lego figure made after her. So hint, hint. So here's a few words from Stephanie Ann.
Reconstructing ancient Greece was quite a challenge. For some city, it was harder to find some specific data. For example, on Mykonos, nothing is remained. So it was quite hard to reproduce exactly the city as it was during antique time. We tried to capture the importance of mythology for the ancient Greeks. The mythology is the integral part of their society, their social behavior, their belief, their religious tradition. Mythology also inspired them in their art, in their decoration of their temple. Also, mythology was used during that time period as a political propaganda.
So, working with Stephanie Ann and other experts made us realize that as game developer, we knew nothing about ancient Greece. And so the best way to get to learn about Greece and its rich history was to get there. So some of us did that with tremendous chance. In fact, 3 groups were sent to do a scouting trip in Greece, which was an amazing experience. Each group were accompanied by experts, so we could ask any questions. And the goal of this scouting trip was to gather as much knowledge as possible. And when we say everything, we did ask questions for everything because we had to build that world from ground up. So we asked questions about topology, history, temple, architectures, animal life, food, everything you can think of, we asked. We took around 13,000 pictures and video during those trips. We visited numerous historical sites. We went to Athens, Sparta, Olympia, Delphi, Crete, Thassos, Macedonia, only to name a few. Extensive academic research were done, workshops were given by experts to our team as well. Since most of the prop and statue are now kept in museum, we visited all of them. So museum database were used also extensively. And in addition to that, another team of researchers worked with Stephanie Ann to create a web-based resource bank called the World Texture Facility, or What the Fuck by most people on the team. So, and those data were not only used by the world team, it was the data was used by the quest designer, animator, character modelers, world director. Everyone, in fact, used that data so to help us to create a more credible but also a very creative world. So more than 1,000 reference pages have been written to support the team throughout the whole project. So before we move to the second part of this presentation, here's a quick video extract of our scouting trip in Greece.
So there was me rocking the GDC t-shirt in Athens like it was all planned from the beginning. So the next step that we moved into was defining the visual pillars. So we'd been on this massive epic trip. We'd come back with thousands of photographs. We'd been through them, started doing metadata so that we could understand where they all were. And to define the visual pillars, what we decided to do was actually to define what we are not. We thought it was easier to go down that route. So after going through all of the previous media that we'd been through, watching loads of cool movies, quite often Greece was depicted as an overcast brown, desaturated world that was quite often monochromatic and quite dry and arid. And that was definitely not what we experienced when we went to Greece. Instead, we discovered a world that was filled with lush biomes, different fauna and flora around the world, diverse, and surrounded by that clear turquoise blue water that you just wanted to jump in and go swimming. And that was the Greece that we wanted to try and recapture, to give to the player, to go on their own journey. We wanted to create a world that felt as though it had been birthed by the gods and have much more variety than just that dry, arid landscape that was often depicted.
So, based on our early research in Scottish in Greece, those keywords were chosen as guidelines for the art and world direction of the world. So all the art opportunities and artistic decisions that were made along the way were to make sure to create the most diverse, visually appealing, and awe-inspiring world to play in. So from a visual point of view, the player will experience a magnificent world filled with mountains and sea, giving the landscape a grandeur never seen before within the brand. The player will discover and experience a massive, vibrant, colorful, and diverse world filled with contrast, and that not only in its biome, but also in its architectures and props, because it was very important for us to achieve that. So here in the next slide, you'll see the early concept art that we've produced to define our art intention, but also to inspire the team. So as you can see, we wanted to make sure to have epic visual elements throughout the world, like those giant big statues. We also wanted to push the color and the saturation as an overall. Remember, we didn't want to create a monochromatic world. And here you can see that even the marketing image that were produced with that in mind. So that means that the vision that we had at the very beginning stayed until the very end of the project, which is very great. Contrast became a key pillar for us. So it was something we really wanted to make sure that we ran through the art of the world. And alongside the notion of contrast is dynamism. So blending those two pillars were also very important for us. So that's why we've created a systemic weather system that allowed us to go from full power thunderstorm to a rainy afternoon to searing blue skies and also sun-kissed beaches. We wanted the world to change around you and continue to offer new sensations as you travel. We've paid a lot of attention to a dynamic time of day to truly support a world contrast between tradition and modernity, religion and science, and the war between Sparta and Athens. Greece is epic and grandiose. In fact, 85% of the Greek landscape is made out of mountains, which makes the whole country pretty epic by itself. But it extended beyond the landscape. We've learned through our research to the ancient Greeks, the building and artwork being produced in this period were colossal compared with anything they had seen before. So it was really important for us to recapture that feeling for the player. So building, statues, and natural landscape all needed to feel like they had been created by the gods.
So once we'd established the visual pillars as a group, it was time to start looking at the world pillars. What did we want the player to experience as they traveled around the world? What did we want them to feel as they explored? So we tapped into the nature of the contrast. So contrast was a pillar that was from the very top of the game, was running right the way through the art direction, and we tapped into that with the world as well. So as they're traveling around the world, they get to feel this change as they move around. So we tapped into the contrast of nature versus man, land versus sea, reason versus myth, beauty versus war, and of course, Sparta versus Athens. Here's a sneak peek at the way the world actually transformed throughout production from the very first map in the top left, transitioning right the way through to the final version. You can see from the very early stages, before we'd even been to visit Greece, we wanted to try and capture the entire Greek Empire, which actually was including Persia as well. And the reason that we decided not to do that in the end turned out to be the fact that we wanted to capture this grandiose landscape. So what we needed to do was to expand on the landscape to be able to build the Peloponnese, build Mount Tegetos and its mountain ranges to show the scale and diversity of the landscape, but also the relationship between the urban sanctuaries of the world and how they related to the terrain. And of course, the water. 60% of our world was water. We were bringing naval back as an open world gameplay for the first time since Black Flag, and it was incredibly important that we gave the player space to be able to explore the world on their boat. One of the key core philosophies of the actual world itself was the idea of honeycomb. So the notion of honeycomb actually copies quite significantly the way the ancient Greeks used to own their landscape, which is different city-states would actually utilize the land between different mountain ranges, and both city-states would know that the region on the other side of that mountain wouldn't cross into their region because that was their region. And I wanted to tap into that, we wanted to tap into that so that we could utilize the different regions as a separate space. We could change the thematic, we could change the type of people, the type of work that you'd see going on in the different regions based on this honeycomb, building mountain ranges between the different areas. So the player, as they're adventuring, they'd climb up a mountain, then they'd get a cool view of the next vista, and then they can move down into that region and play inside of that region.
So now that our visual pillars were done for both the art and the world, it was time for us to move into the production phases, so the real fun could begin. So before moving to the phase 3 of this presentation, let's have a little bit of fun.
Choose life, choose a job, choose a career, choose a family. Choose leisure wear and matching luggage. Choose a three-piece suite on hire purchase in a range of fabrics. Choose a fucking big television. Choose washing machines, cars, compact disc players and electrical tin openers. Choose good health, low cholesterol, and dental insurance. Choose fixed interest mortgage repayments. Choose a starter home. Choose your friends. Choose DIY and wondering who the fuck you are on a Sunday morning. Choose sitting on that couch, watching mind-numbing, spirit-crushing game shows, stuffing fucking junk food into your mouth. Choose rotting away at the end of it all, pissing your last in a miserable home, nothing more than an embarrassment to the selfish, fucked-up brats you spawned to replace yourself.
I'll do this.
Choose your future. Choose life.
So now we've done the shameless plug, we'll move on to the rest of the presentation.
Sorry, we couldn't resist. So in order to build this monster, we needed to be disciplined in how we built it, and we needed to be free to iterate, scale, scope as we work without costing the earth at the same time. And this massive enterprise couldn't have been possible without the help of our world managers. They played a key role in organizing the production, and supporting the director's vision was a key here. So we did change the team structures to be more agile. So not fully agile, but our own version of agile. So each core art department had their own product owner, empowering the experts to be responsible for the quality and quantity of assets produced for the game world. So by trusting our people, we've created engagement and commitment amongst them, and we can say that they all had a huge impact on the final look of the game because they were part of the decision-making process.
So the notion of one team became something that was incredibly important for us throughout production, and the slogan was something that we built on as we went. Coming off the back of Assassin's Creed Syndicate, we wanted to build on the relationships that we created to build that game, and we wanted to work together as one team under one vision. So we actually utilized the skill sets of 9 other teams led from Ubisoft Quebec to utilize the skill sets of multiple different studios around the world, all focusing together and channeling their energy on this one vision, making sure that we could build a world that was cohesive and playable as one whole thing. So next came the world phases. Now, this phases system isn't something that's brand spanking new. It's not rocket science, but it's something that I've been working for many years, working back on games like Need for Speed. And it's a way of making sure that we can clearly define at separated gates how the world's going to be and how you're going to be able to play inside of that world at any different given time during production. So we knew that the scope of what we were trying to do was huge, so we needed to make sure we worked in a disciplined way to make sure we could make informed decisions at each step of the production process. So phase one was all about learning. So we'd been doing all this research, we'd gone back to school, we'd been getting help from a historian who was now in-house, but it was now time for the team to get that empowerment. It was time for the level artists, level designers, texturers, narrative team, everyone to start to understand this information. So at this point in the project, the level artists and level designers are working together as one world-building team, learning each other's skill set, understanding how each other's disciplines are important to each other. And they start to work on the information that we've put together as a group, and they start to input into that information. So we created lots of documentation, and this one specifically was interesting because it was a visual map that we created that had a host of different elements of information that could be tapped into, looking into the actual historical data of each of the different regions of ancient Greece, tapping into the trade, the population, whether it was an oligarchy or a monarchy, how big their army was, especially what kind of things they were making or doing, because that tapped into then what we wanted to do with that region to give it its thematic. From that, the team then started to build their own world documents, which we could then look into, giving them the creativity to take all this information we've been giving them and start to build up the plans for what they want to do with the world and how the world's going to be built based around this information. And as part of the phase one, we built what we call the paper maps. So we created 2D Photoshop maps of every single region of the world, and we looked into how the topology was going to work, what we were going to see in terms of, is it going to be foresty, is it going to be fields, and what kind of cultivation is going to be happening. And we did this for the entire Greek world before we did anything in 3D, allowing us to communicate clearly with each of the different departments what they were going to get. Obviously this is not final, things are going to change, but it allowed the quest team to start look at where their quest hubs are going to be. The narrative team could tap into the different thematics we were planning on doing, so they could write stories around that and start to decide where key characters are going to be positioned throughout the world.
So there comes thematization, or pizza slice, as we love to call this. So building such a massive world made out of tons of cities, villages, sanctuaries, and everything you can think of, for us thematization was super important because we didn't want our player to have a sentiment or déjà vu, as we say in French. So we work a lot with thematization and simplification. So let's say, for example, within a city, like Athens, which would be made out of several districts. Each district had their own thematics. So let's say the pottery zone will have only potteries and maybe oven to cook potteries, but we would avoid placing too much prop in it so the player could easily identify what was that region was about. And we did that same recipe throughout the whole world to make sure that the player will never encounter the same recipe all over the place.
With the documentation and paper maps in place and approved, we were started to look at how the terrain was going to work. The terrain forms the foundation of everything we're going to do, and it was incredibly important to the ancient Greeks. They used the terrain very logically to use it for fortification and use it for where they're going to plan to place their cities. So we referenced elements such as digital elevation data from NASA, a lot of Google Earth. I think a lot of people were zooming in on Greece quite often during this project. And then as well as that, the reference that we took when we went out to Greece to build up a visual picture of the simplification of the terrain at this point so that we could create these honeycomb elements around the different regions of the game. And jumping forward a little bit, what we did with that terrain then was hand it off to our 3 terrain artists who covered the entire 256 square kilometers of Greece, working that basic terrain through Mudbox, sculpting it into something that's more defined, and then adding the erosion paths through World Machine to give us the final version of the terrain that we see in the game to date. So now that our terrain was giving shape, we could start kicking in the biome team and the loop. So under the leadership of Vincent Lamontagne, which was the biome leader, we established that the world needed a great visual diversity, so the biome played a key role into that. So we had to make sure that each of our biomes were contrasted from one another. And in fact, there's probably 2 biomes in Greece, but we decided to play with season and an exotic biome to make sure that the land look and feel different as an overall. So here we did apply the same technique as we did for everything else. Based on our study and research, we started to create like elevation stripes. So we took so many pictures, and we found also pictures all over the place. We established like which type of plant were growing at different type of elevation in the Greek landscape, because that's how our biome recipe were applied per elevation.
So we did that same technique for every biome, and once we were happy with the result and making sure that each biome look and feel different from one another, we could start the production of them. So when we do a biome, we need to produce every asset that's take place in it. So we need to produce all the trees, bushes, clutter, name it, there's a lot of them. And also we needed to produce all the textures for all those vegetation assets. And the same thing applies to the rocks, boulder, ground textures. For this production, and we'll talk it very soon, we use substance designers, substance painters to produce all our material and texture. Water, Ben briefly talked about water, but the water plays a massive role in our role in gameplay experience. Since 60% of our world surface is made out of water, we try to create the most awesome and diversified experience when it comes to water, and we treat it as a main character. So we wanted to be able to convey a feeling of embarking on a true Odyssey, which means being able to travel by boat and engage in naval combat. So the agency is the host of many dangers and treasures, which will tempt the player to set sail, explore its farthest reach, and dive into its depth. And so we are pretty happy to have created a seamless naval experience. So here you'll see the first volumetric foam and crashing wave test that we did with our friends in Bucharest, which were in charge of our water. So flowing wave and volumetric foam were super important and a big challenge. As you can see, it's even lagging because it's a prototype, but once we saw that, we knew that we had something very special in our end, and we are more than happy with the in-game result that we have right now. But even with 7 key biomes, we thought it was not enough. Our landscape is so huge that we needed more. So we've created sub-biomes to make sure to offer the most visual diversity to our players. So we've created here the clay mine, the snow peak cap mountains, marshland, and also burnt forest as example.
So running in parallel with the biome work, the world building team are starting to put together what we called phase 3, which is grey blocking. Again, not a new notion whatsoever, but one thing that was incredibly important to us was to make sure that we did this grey blocking pass for the entirety of the Greek landscape so that we could make informed decisions on how things were laying in the land, the relationship between the urban sanctuaries and villages and cities and the natural terrain and landscape, so that we could move forward with a logical step at each phase of the way, but also so that the entire game could be played very, very early on. You could explore the entire world, and we could have the quest team play it, and they could start planning where things are going to be, sight lines between quest givers and quest objectives. So it was very important for us to get this in very, very quickly. The top 2 screens there are actually from Athens that we built in 2016, and the layout of Athens hasn't really changed that much. It's just that we've evolved on it over time. One of the other big things that Thierry tapped on as one of our 6 key points was the notion of 2 weekly sprints. So every 2 weeks we would get together with the entire team and showcase the work of the world team. And this was the entire world. We'd make a video over the weekend before the week before. The presentation would be on the Monday, and we could showcase to everybody the world that was going to be available to play that week in the build. And it allowed us to have constant communication, constant feedback from the team, and be able to see the progression of the world as we move forward. And to do that, we were going to need architecture and lots of it. So this was the product owner for architecture was Dominique Laduparty, who had a lot of experience working on previous Assassin's Creed titles, so he was a great person to take on the architecture mandate for us during Odyssey. And again, he started the process, and you'll hear us repeat this a couple of times more, making sure he tapped into the historical information that was available for architecture, because while the notion of Greek architecture is something I think most people can picture, the number of details and fine elements that actually go into making these buildings is incredible, and it was important for us to make sure that we built them in a correct manner. So
throughout our research, we've learned something that we did not expect. Archaeologists have found that everything was painted back then, so from an art direction point of view, that kind of was a blessing. So we took that opportunity and added colors to almost all man-made structures, which gave us I think a very unique, incredible way of how ancient Greece could have looked like 2,500 years ago, which I think is fairly incredible. So historically, colors have always been seen as a status symbol, and our collective tastes have definitely changed over centuries. So seeing those statues, classic statues, recreate in vivid color seems gaudy, almost obscene to us today, because we expect ancient Greek statuary to bear that dignified, blank, white look. But then when they were created, bright colors helped them to give detail and depth to the sculptures, and even according to the artists and art lover of that time period, their statues were considered ugly and unsightly. So that's why you're seeing a lot of painted statues in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, because we wanted to stay true to how they were back then.
But just because we're making a game based in history doesn't mean we're making a recreation. There's still an awful lot of creativity that goes into building this world. And we relied heavily on our concept artists, especially early on, because like we said, a lot of the things that we were going to try and build in our game don't exist anymore. They're merely just bricks in the ground, or in most cases, they've been rebuilt on top of from many other civilizations. So with all this information about color, we started to tap into the concept art of how we were going to compose the different elements of the game, especially for some of the things like the suburbs and places that aren't concentrated on so much by archaeologists. And they were able to start producing these strips that we created that would then be used by the world building team to build the composition of cities and villages throughout the world. But also looking at the materials and the colors, a lot of elements in Greece were actually built out of wood, which is something that we never expected. So wooden temples was something that was a bit of a surprise to us and allowed us to bring a flavor and a thematic to Greece that I think most people didn't expect to see. As well as that, we wanted to be it was important to us to make sure we tapped into the history beyond the history that we were recreating. So the ancient Greeks of our time period were aware of the Mycenaean and the Minoan civilizations that had come before. So it was important for us to make sure we captured that, and the team went ahead and made the Mycenaean and Minoan kits for us to be able to utilize on the world building side to create some of the really interesting POIs that you can explore, play, and in most cases fight in. Here's a few examples of some of the other architecture kits that were built for the project. In total, we built over 35 architecture kits, and while you see them on this big one page, there's a lot of similarities between them. As we mentioned before, it's all about the fine details, making sure that the columns are the correct type of column, making sure that the pediments are the correct type of pediment, and these details were something that we really wanted to pay attention to make a credible world.
I think you will all agree that a world without texture would be missing something. So, of course, we had texture in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, but we did change something in our pipeline. And that wouldn't have been possible without the help of those two guys who did the talk like Tuesday, and it's available. It's called Texturing the World of Assassin's Creed. So Vincent Desrosiers and Pierre Flo did make this change happen. So prior to Assassin's Creed Odyssey, most of the time texture were created in Photoshop and exported in our in-house engine, which is Anvil. It's a proven technique, it's working very well, it can give awesome result, but we wanted something more homogeneous, and and also that would react well under every lighting condition. So we wanted all our materials to be PBR, which means physically based rendering. So we integrated Substance Designer, Substance Painter throughout our pipeline. So meaning that every texture material were built using those two software. And also what they did is they used both software strengths. So they used Painter and Substance main key points to create our materials. So the thing is, the whole team converted and started to use those software as an overall. So every texture that you're seeing in Assassin's Creed Odyssey have been created using those two software. They've created a total of 1,500 texture with a relatively small team, which is very good. And the other big aspect of working with Substance Designer is that we can iterate and very fast. It's a procedural software, so we could ask for changes and they could react very fast, and we could then polish our game, which was a bit more difficult using the old technique.
So the next part of the project, we're around about halfway through at this point, about 1.5 years in, was what we called phase 4, which was intent. So at this point of the project, especially on the world building side, was the first time we actually split the team between level art and level design specific disciplines so that we could start to focus in on the very key details of each of the two disciplines. The level designers making sure that they could make the most fun areas that they could, concentrating on the forts, the caves, making sure that the tombs were fun to explore and navigate and had a little bit of challenge and puzzle, while at the same time, the level artists were making sure that the placement of every single object in the world was just perfect. So this came down to the two product owners for each of the disciplines. Mathieu Lechance was lead level designer, and Safi Sada was in charge of the level art. And these guys were the guys responsible for pushing the world to what we call alpha. So alpha for us was 1 year before launch, an incredibly important milestone for us to ensure that we've got enough time to be able to polish the world to its full max that we can, making sure that we can change the world and tweak the world to make sure that the quests have got everything that they need, and we can tell the stories that we want the player to experience as they travel around the world. To do this, we made some pretty cool tools, and here's just a couple. This is one of my favorite. It's called the Cave tool. It was built by a multidisciplinary team, and it allowed us to be able to create Lego kits that had a logical system with a logical UI that could allow pretty much anyone on the team, and we tested it with producers, and producers could make caves that were fun. They had lighting, they had navigation, parkour, and collectibles, and this system allowed us to create the vast amount of caves that we built throughout the world. The system was built on top of the Entity Maker, which was a tool that was created to allow us to create the numerous statues that you see in the world. There's thousands and thousands of different iterations of the statues, and basically it was built on the same system. Lego kit statues that could plug into each other, all with logic and data to make sure you couldn't do wacky different poses. And we also used the same system for the market so that we could allow the level artists to concentrate on doing cool stuff instead of placing pots after pots after pots.
And there's a lot of props in our game. So speaking of prop, in order to make a vibrant and varied and dense world, we needed a lot of props. So the project owner for the props was responsible for the creation of the props for the entire world and to ensure that each of them were compliant with the technical and also gameplay guidelines. So the props were under the leadership of Ariane Trottier. So since most of the props have long time gone, since our time period was 2,500 years ago, we needed to add the concept artists into that team so to conceptualize needs given by either the quest designer, level artist, level designer as well. So they could actually illustrate those props that don't exist anymore. The team was also responsible for making all the boats that you see in the game. So they did all the archetypes like the Spartan, Athenian, and also pirate boats, but also they did the player boat with all its customization and also upgrades. They did all the statues. In Assassin's Creed Odyssey, there's a lot of statues, around 120 of them. And it adds up with the Entity Maker where you can make tons of variation of most of the statues. So they've been doing also all the props that were placed in the Entity Maker as just shown. And of course, all the texture and material used or created for those props were done also in Substance Designer and Substance Painter, sorry about that. So in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, we've created around 4,000 props, which is a lot, but they were used in specific regions, so it helped us to thematize each zone of the world. So we've created a showroom to have an overview because there were so many of them, so the main challenge was to use them all.
So we've now built a beautiful world. It's got incredible gameplay, it's fun to play in, but it's not yet a living world, and our goal was to create a living world. So this is where we brought in Michael Le Jaguar Gigard. That's a bit of my Quebecois there that I learned while I was up there. And he was the product owner for Living World. So what Mike did is, surprise, surprise, he did his research, and working with a historian, we made sure that he understood the people of ancient Greece, how the people lived, how they worked, where they slept, what tools they used, what did they wear hats? Hats became incredibly important for some reason at some point. So he basically went in and did all of that research and then started working with his team to build the living world of ancient Greece. So building on top of the Meta AI system that was created for Assassin's Creed Origins, an incredibly powerful tool that meant that each NPC in the world has their own schedule. They need to go to work, they need to go to sleep, they need to go and pee, and they will have their life and they will do it. So you can follow them around and you can watch people as they move around the world living their life. One of the new things that we brought for Assassin's Creed Odyssey was the fact that they would actually not just do this life without paying attention to you, the player. If you get caught by an NPC in Assassin's Creed Odyssey doing something that you shouldn't do, the thing that we introduced was the notion of smart objects. An NPC will react to the fact that you are doing something that you shouldn't be. If they're a courageous person, they will then go and find a nearby prop. It might be a spade, it might be a shovel, it might be a sword if they're lucky, and they'll bring that fight to you so that the loop of fighting continues, and some of them are pretty tough to beat as well. This also included the animal pass. No. We created over 450 individually motion captured stations for Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and we also built all of the props that we needed to make sure that they were using the correct items that they would do. But also using the system of Meta AI, it created thousands of different possibilities of living world scenarios that you could see taking place throughout the world. This also moved on to animals. We also wanted to bring mythology to the world, and we haven't talked about it much, but we drenched the world in different mythology, and one of the ones we tapped into was the 12 labors of Hercules. So scattered throughout the world are these incredibly awesome legendary animals, and these were part of the open living world that you could experience as you traveled around. So we're coming towards the end of production at this point, and we move into phase 5, which is what we call the final level pass. It's the quality pass. At this point, level artists are really taking the time to move each little item just a few centimeters, checking it from every angle like they like to do, and making sure it's perfect. At the same time, the level designers are making sure that all of the NPCs have got everything they need to fulfill their actions, make sure that if you attack a fort, they've got all the weapons they need to attack you, make sure they've got places that they can go and sleep and go and eat without leaving the fort undefended, which did happen at one point. And we're getting to the point now where we're making a world that's starting to feel like it's ready to be played.
So it's nearly the end, guys. So by remaining true to our vision, focus and discipline in how we worked, trusting in each other, we were able to create a world that we wanted to create while keeping the game engaged and empowered without any major scope. And then building at the same time the foundation that was for a game that was critically acclaimed. So for us, the 6 keywords, the thing that changed everything onto this production is that we started to do our own work. We gathered the knowledge. We didn't rush in production. We took the time to get to know about what was ancient Greece. We studied so much, and not only at the beginning, but throughout the whole production. And even today, we still think we can learn about ancient Greece.
Essential to the product as well was the team engagement and empowerment. By giving product ownership to the experts, we were able to tap into their knowledge and expertise to allow them to control their own vision, control their own quality, control their own backlog, and really build upon their own department, which were all filtering down into the quality that we ended up with. On top of that, the world phases, by sticking to that, we rigidly fought for that to make sure that we could continuously build the world up in these different layers from beginning to end to make sure that we could continuously make empowered decisions as we worked.
Yes, and the integration of Substance Designer and Painter to our pipeline truly changed things. Not only gave us the homogeneity we were looking for, but it gave us the possibility to iterate easily so we can polish the game quite a lot. The sprint review every 2 weeks also at first was perceived as a big burden by most teams, but then the turnaround happened and people were quite happy to showcase what they were working on. It helped us greatly on the communication side, so everyone could have inside the vision of the whole project, so it proven to be very efficient for us.
It sounds super cliched, but we're making a video game, so having fun was definitely something that was important for us. We're like 2 kids, so we like to mess about, so it was important the rest of the team got to mess about too, and I think that's something that you can see as you play the game for yourself.
True. So I can speak for Ben and I. One of the aspects that we're the most proud of is definitely the fact that as a team, we've managed to produce this massive world, and it was an enormous challenge. And we did build it always trying to improve the game, frequently questioning ourselves, having the courage to change things when needed. So the willingness and the commitment of the team is something that we're definitely proud of. So that's it, guys. This is the end of our presentation. We hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Before we jump into questions, we've got somebody who's just got a message for everybody in the room.
Alexios, tell us when AC Japan's coming out. Let me tell you what I know about Assassin's Creed Japan. Nothing! There is no place more glorious than Sparta.
So if some of you have any questions, there's Mike in the room.
Hello. First off, brilliant talk. Thank you very much. It was a really tiny part of the presentation, but you touched on a cave tool that you built, and it was just after the level that you spoke about level designers and artists working together. Can you just talk through the process that you went through with creating those small caves? Obviously, was it a case of the artist fed the tool and the designers built the caves from that? And overall, like how many cave systems did you end up building for the game?
So in terms of process, it definitely wasn't art-driven. It was a multidisciplinary team that got together. So we had a level designer, level artist, and technical director that was in the room when we first kicked off building that tool. And it needed that technical input to make sure we had all the data labeled correctly. It was very much design-driven from that point onwards, building out all of the grey block versions of the caves to create all the pieces that we need to create interesting navigational routes, make sure we're hitting all the different lighting requirements in terms of GI. And then once we'd got that locked down, we got the art team involved with building the actual final versions of the cave, because they're expensive, right? So we want to make sure that we've got it right before we move forward. And then it was kind of empowerment for level designers and artists to be able to create caves in the world. And we ended up with, I think off the top of my head, it's about 400 cave systems in the world.
Thanks very much.
Hello. So if you look at a game like Zelda Breath of the Wild, they're super disciplined about reserving certain colors, silhouettes, and shapes for their visual language to communicate kind of gameplay information diegetically in the world. And I'm pretty sure you have a very different process than they did, but I'm curious whether you have any like high-level rules or takeaways from kind of developing a visual language like that in your world.
Yeah, absolutely. We did. We created a palette of objects that were going to be utilized by the different factions throughout the game. So the military had their specific types of asset that we would use to communicate, okay, you're going to get involved with the military at this point, so you know what kind of gameplay you're going to get. And then similarly, the different factions of the game, the Daughters of Artemis, the Followers of Ares, they had a very specific palette of props that we used to communicate clearly as you were arriving. And then on top of that, we layered the dynamic banners with the logos and things to really just push it home. After iterating it through playtest, we just wanted to make sure that was hammered home.
Thanks.
So the scale of your world is really impressive, and the sheer amount of detail you're packing into pretty much every square meter. I was wondering if you could talk at all about your approach to working with a world on that scale. Like, did you use procedural techniques, and how do you manage so many artists working on one world at the same time?
Well, of course, we did use procedural generation, especially for the biomes. So every plants, trees that you see that are not in cities are procedurally generated. So that's one of the, without that, we wouldn't have been possible to put that word on the box, because there's so many ground to cover. And the
Managing artists?
Yeah, the world is so big that it was kind of easy to manage every artist, because they've been put in each section, so each of them had their own sections to work on. The workload was shared also with other studios. Singapore was heavily involved with the islands that you see in the game. So each artist or group of artists had their own zone, so it was quite simple.
Plus we had rockstar leads as well.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, how do you split up the world between artists? Do they check out tiles of the world, or do they work on that data in other ways?
So the system that we've got is a little bit more dynamic than checking out tiles. But what we tried to do, so in the early phases, we were actually very kind of hippie with how we worked on the world to make sure that everyone kind of got a little bit of input into everything. And then as we got throughout the phases, we started to solidify the world. We also started to solidify the team. So then we'd have a level artist, level designer biome who'd be working together specifically on a region so that we had clear points of contact.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So one of my favorite things about Origins was the history that went into all the work, and essentially just like using historians to discover things that we didn't actually know before some of the research that your company had done. Is there, how much of that did happen with Odyssey, and is there any chance of a discovery tour as well? Because I think that was one of the most fantastic things about Origins.
So I'll jump onto that one. So the world actually, it was really important to us to tap into the history. So pretty much everything we put in the game, even though there's a massive amount of creativity, has some type of historical link back to it. So if it's a mythical statue we've placed out in the countryside, it relates back to a paragraph of a book somewhere that's been researched, and we're tapping into that. And then so they're actually all in the game, and there is actually a massive amount of historical detail in the historical POIs that most people don't find. You have to change the filter on the map. And yes, I can confirm that there will be a discovery tour for Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Awesome. I think we're going to go that way.
Yeah, hi. So, first of all, thank you so much for coming down and sharing your insights with us. The talk was really amazing. Loved it. I was really impressed by the amount of research, the extent of research that had gone into the project right from the very beginning. I wanted to know, because I know that there are a lot of companies out there that still do not invest the amount of time and budget in research. So what does it take? How much of a budget goes into researching before you actually get hands-on, get started with a project? And how would you encourage younger companies to invest time in research and development before they actually get into production for a project?
So I won't talk about it in terms of money cost, but in terms of people cost,
Sure.
it was incredibly important to us. And like Thierry said, as one of the takeaways, the fact that we put that time up front was important, because not only did we start to learn more about what we were dealing with, but also being an Assassin's Creed game, history was incredibly important. And we want to make sure that we do justice to the culture that we're working with as well. It's a Greek culture, it's rich, it's very passionate, and we wanted to make sure we were, looking at that properly. And I just say that doing that homework up front was definitely a benefit, and if you're going to be doing something along those lines, it's definitely worthwhile.
All right, thank you.
Thanks for the great presentation. I would like it if you could touch a little bit about VFX integration with the world, and at what point did you start integrating things like the weather systems and other interactive effects, ambient effects, and did the world artists or anybody else have to do anything in particular to make the world work well with those effects?
We started right from the beginning working on our time of day and weather system, and we iterated on them throughout the whole production until we were satisfied with. The workload for the artists is mostly on the material and texture, so they had to make sure that when it's raining, let's say, those material will go wet and reflective. So, and also the wind. The wind has a huge impact on the perception of weather. So we had to make sure that our tree would react, trees and every process, in fact, that has tissues and stuff like that would react well to the wind.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I am super interested in hearing more about the processes of the historical research that went into it. You mentioned that you guys consulted with a historian who later became an in-house historian, and I wanted to ask what their job is like. What are their duties? What contributions does that particular position give to the project?
So I'll speak for Stephanie. She's basically like a powerhouse who knows everything we needed to know about the history of Greece, but also being a doctor in this already, she knows how to research, and that was the important thing. Was she knew where to go to get the information, which books she needed to read, and literally her desk was just littered with books, and like they're everywhere, right? And
she can read ancient Greek.
Yeah, she can read ancient Greek, and she was reading books that I think probably haven't been read by anyone for many, many years, and finding things that probably haven't been read again for many, many years. So these things that we were able to put into the world that probably people didn't expect because it had been forgotten somewhere.
That is awesome. Thank you.
Hi. First off, wonderful talk. Thank you so much. Something I'm really curious about is you said that there were 10 different studios working on the same project, so all across the world, different time zones and everything. And how did art directing so many teams work, and how were you able to keep them all on the same page?
Caffeine.
Yeah, well,
Do you have, like,
there's
any
caffeine, of
strategies,
course,
or?
but the thing, every studio has its own art director or associate art director, so they are managing their team on their side. So, and we talk about trusting people. So as long, as art director, you establish the frame, but it's to your people to define what's within the frame. So, of course, we're always there as director to make sure that the vision stay true to the initial intent, but then it's up to them to put water to the mill. So they were all participants in the overall art direction of the game in a way. So, and then we did the weekly communication with them, conf call on link, Skype. So sometimes it was morning for us, evening for them, and vice versa. So we do try to, because the secret of that is communication. So we need to talk with them the more often as possible.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi there. I'm curious what the relationship between the researcher and the directors were. Was it a good relationship? Was there ever any tension?
when we came up with History for the Win, that was a good day. So no, it definitely was incredible, and we worked very closely together. So when we were defining a lot of the early on research, and we were starting to put things on maps and put things into documents, she was involved in pretty much every single meeting. Yeah. Like I said, she's a powerhouse, and Stephanie, and she like worked like crazy for us throughout the project. Just the amount of information she was bringing to us, there was always something new for us to play with. And I wouldn't say that there was tension, but she obviously wanted to make sure everything we were doing is as credible as possible. So whenever we got a little bit too crazy with our creativity, she'd try and rein us back in again. And that was the only time where we had kind of the yin and the yang, and we feel like we managed to balance everything.
Thank you.
Hey, you mentioned procedural tools for the terrain generation as well as for the vegetation. And also you had this cool thing about the statues, which is really inspiring. What about the buildings? Were they all individually created, or was there any kind of like way to automate some of that?
Well, all the level art that you see in the game is placed by hand. So, but though working with the architecture, it's made out of modules, so we can assemble like houses and kits. The whole gain of that is memory. So, so we can it's iteration of the same module. So, but everything that you see that is level art is basically made by hand. So we have exclusion zone in our world, so where the vegetation won't be generated, so it's kind of off the map. So we have a ton of those areas, and those areas were very worked in detail by our level artists.
And of course, the final message, Ubisoft are hiring, so if you'd be interested in joining us on one of our incredible projects, you can visit the Ubisoft Lounge on the second floor of the West Hall, and there'll be people there to chat with you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for coming.